Dear God, is every country on fire right now? Hello, my friends, Tucker here, and welcome back to the History of Everything podcast. If you have been following our podcast or YouTube content or anything like that, you'll know that we've been following the progress for the overwhelming social movements that have been dubbed the Gen Z fall here on this channel, and it has been wild. From Indonesia to Madagascar and Malaysia to Nepal, by the time spring comes back around, I genuinely at this point wouldn't be so surprised if I ended up bringing up a report about how penguins have overthrown the status quo in Antarctica because, go figure, maybe they just don't want the scientists there anymore. I don't know. I say that because before it is that we could even get a video script started for the events that were occurring in Madagascar, which, yes, that's a thing that I'm working on, and I'm going to get. It's just been very busy before it is that I leave for Japan for our group trip. Peru decided that it was time to raise the One Piece Jolly Roger high, and by this point, at least half the thumbnails that I've put out for my videos in the last couple of weeks seem to have had the One Piece Jolly Roger flag on it, which really does speak to the overall movement started by these younger citizens of countries all around the world. As for what is going on in Peru, well, for that, we are going to need to either go and watch The Emperor's New Groove, or we're going to need to look back through the shadows of history for context. And I'll give you a hint of which one we're doing. This video is not sponsored by Disney or anything like that. Oh, but you know who we are sponsored by? Today's episode has been sponsored by Rocket Money. My friends, for anyone who has not heard of Rocket Money here before, I highly recommend them. Rocket Money is quite simply an all-in-one personal finance app that helps you cancel subscriptions, lower bills, and manage your money better. This is arguably now more necessary in today's day and age than ever because not only is every single thing a subscription, but simultaneously every subscription is getting much more expensive. And I really hate that. I honestly love using Rocket Money because I'm the type of guy who ends up signing up for a bunch of free trials for things in order to be able to get access to different types of media or articles for my research, and then I subsequently forget that I signed up for said free trial and then get charged for many months. So once I've gone and connected my bank account, Rocket Money goes and scans through all my subscriptions, and I can choose which ones I want to help get canceled. And the savings from this can be massive. Rocket Money has helped to save its customers up to $740 a year when you use all the app's premium features. They've also helped customers save over $880 million in canceled subscriptions alone. Genuinely, my friends, I do recommend Rocket Money, and I'm not just saying this as an ad, I'm saying this as a recommendation from something that I have used for quite literally years. You can get a free trial for Rocket Money by going and clicking my link down in the description or scanning the QR code that you can see here. And considering how messy everything is in the world nowadays, at the very least, you can have your finances in control. Get started for free, and by all means, enjoy the rest of the show. I really hope that last transition and joke went over well. Now, normally, my friends, when it is that we are talking about things like this, we need to kick back through history by decades or even centuries for such a story. But the thing is, when we are describing Peru's problems, such as weak political parties, this, yes, may be relics of years gone by, but what is affecting the people of Peru now primarily seems to have started back in the 90s, specifically 1992. So we don't necessarily need to even go back more than a generation to get a bigger picture of what is happening. Though for a lot of channels, even that is too much, but that's just how we operate here. To explain what it is that I mean, back in the year 1992, Alberto Fujimori would win his first presidential term in Peru. He was the country's first leader of Japanese descent, and his middle name is Kenya, which, me saying that isn't necessarily very important, but I just felt like I needed to go ahead and mention that since he was a man of Japanese ethnicity leading a South American country with a African middle name. Yeah, Peru is different. Anyway, after only 6 months in office, Fujimori would band together with the National Intelligence Service and the Peruvian Armed Forces, and together they would carry out Plan Verde, which was a rare self-coup against the Peruvian legislature and judiciary. It's considered a self-coup because, technically speaking, Fujimori was removing himself from power as well. Quickly, Fujimori would go and dissolve the Peruvian Congress and Supreme Court, and because he was leading the plan, guess who becomes the de facto ruler of Peru now? That's right, Alberto Kenya Fujimori. Surprise, surprise. Now, of course, this coup was heavily criticized by nearly everyone from the Peruvian politicians to intellectuals and journalists and more. But that all being said, the private business sector loved Fujimori's policies and supported him greatly. Ultimately, the coup was successful because of one very important factor that is almost universally necessary to take over a government. You have to have control or cooperation of the military and its commanders. So, Fujimori set about immediately following the coup to draft a new constitution for the state in 1993. This was approved by the people in a referendum, and then Fujimori was elected president under the new constitution in 1995. From there, he would go on to win a third term in the year 2000, and I guess that's pretty much what it is that we would expect to happen and the way that it would continue. But this is when the cracks in his regime would start to show. Because you see, for most of his time in office, Alberto Fujimori would act as a brutal authoritarian ruler. He oversaw excessive use of propaganda, deeply entrenched political corruption, numerous extrajudicial killings, and to top it all off, human rights violations, which the extrajudicial killings are a part of, but he did a lot more than just that. So how did he get those last charges, you may wonder? Well, again, showing that absolute power corrupts absolutely, Fujimori made sure that Plan Verde included provisions to round up Peru's indigenous populations and forcefully sterilize them. Yeah. As time went on, the heat began to get way too hot for Fujimori around the turn of the millennium, and he really had to bounce before too long. So, eventually, he flees to exile in Japan, and in one of the most Japanese actions of our modern age, he submitted his resignation as president on a fax machine, which is very fitting considering what it is that we've talked about with Japanese business practices, which I feel that we're going to need to go back to because of their population crisis and issue, but that's going to be a whole other thing. So yeah, that happened, but then guess what? In one of the best political moves in history, something would happen right after this, as the Peruvian Congress was so pissed off at Fujimori that they refused to let him resign, just so that way they could vote to remove him from office. Like, ultimately, yes, it does result in the same thing, but it's the principle of the matter that no, you don't get to resign. We're firing you. From here, you would probably expect that Fujimori would spend his remaining years stuck in Japan and not doing anything that could potentially risk being extradited to Peru. But that's not the case. Peruvian authorities would later catch up with him while he was visiting his wife in Chile in late 2005. So yeah. Anyway, in April of 2009, Fujimori would finally be convicted of human rights violations, as well as ordering kidnappings and murders and other things that were conducted by his subordinates. Then he was hit by a wave of embezzlement charges totaling up to like $600 million. Adjusted for inflation, that means he took over $1 billion in today's money from his own government, which is a lot, of course. Either way, Fujimori was found guilty of murder, bodily harm, and 2 cases of kidnapping. Then came the big charges, the human rights violations. This would mark the very first time that an elected head of state was tried and convicted of human rights violations, which seems like it, should have happened in at least a century ago or so, but no, there you are. Out of all the things that we've shared with you on this channel, of our podcast, of anything, this one fact might actually be the hardest to believe is true, but it is. Yeah, sure, plenty of state leaders have been charged, but convicted and sentenced is a different thing. Although Fujimori wasn't too worried. He had connections. Peru, by this point, was basically a mafia state, and Alberto Fujimori was at the head of the entire organization. Another reason he probably wasn't too worried was because at the time, Peruvian law demanded that all sentences be served concurrently, which means that they'd count him serving those various charges all at the same time. This also means that the maximum amount of time that he could be jailed was only 25 years, which is kind of disappointing, really. Like, this guy took away people's ability to have children. Do not forget that. That is a thing that was done. That is one of the worst and most calculated things that you can do to any population. But hey, guess what? He definitely would not even serve that. In December of 2017, Alberto Fujimori was unfortunately pardoned by President Pedro Pablo Kuczynski in exchange for Fujimori's son, Congressman Kenji Fujimori, to help President Kuczynski survive a pending impeachment vote. Yeah. Then he spent about 5 years being in and out of jail as various courts would overrule or support the pardon. Eventually, by December of 2023, he was ordered to be released for good. And I know for those of you that are listening right now, that is going to seem pretty disappointing, but do not worry, actually, because once he was released, the Peruvian government then went and filed charges against him relating to the forced sterilization of the indigenous. This would occupy actually most of his time in 2024, but Mother Nature had a better idea and gave Alberto Fujimori tongue cancer. And within 5 months, the cancer had ravaged his body and gave the indigenous population at least some justice while it is that he awaited trial. Ultimately, Alberto Fujimori would finally die on September 11th, 2024 at 86 years old. And that would be the end of him. But what about Peru and its political state, you may wonder? After all, why was this guy even able to get a pardon, though? Well, here's the thing. After the year 2000, which saw Fujimori ousted, Peru started to clean itself up. They did hold legitimate, clean elections between 2001 and 2014, and the economy would grow pretty consistently, and poverty would drop more dramatically than anywhere else in Latin America. It was genuinely impressive and positive. In fact, the removal of systemic corruption and embezzlement was so effective that when the 2008 global financial crisis was going on, Peru was relatively okay, which is very impressive for a export-based economy. Their economy wasn't destroyed by it nearly as much as their neighbors, and they in fact bounced back from it pretty quickly compared to the rest of the continent. Now, that all being said, let's not get it twisted here. There was and still is a considerable wealth disparity between those in major coastal cities in Peru compared to the poorer Quechua and Aymara-speaking communities in the highlands. Which is not great, but still, the crime rate was dropping and politicians were finishing their terms, and a number of them were not embezzling billions of dollars from the government. So, for most Peruvians, it was still a big win compared to the Fujimori regime. But wait, it does get worse again. You see, my friends, starting around 2016, two things really would change, launching Peru on its current, unhappier path. First, Alberto Fujimori's daughter, Keiko, heir to his political movement, would run for president and lost, while at the same time still gaining control of Congress. So, over the next 4 years, she, her party, and its allies would use what control they had to oust two presidents with whom they clashed, substantially weakening the power of the executive branch. From here, after reining in the president, Congress itself started to rule everything, as it still does today. What has truly set Peru on its path to where it is today has been a failure to balance the powers and responsibilities of its government. We'll explain that more here later. At the same time that all of this was going on, Peruvian prosecutors were pissed off, and so they got busy investigating corruption at every level of government. The people supported these investigations by a vast majority, but the government put a stop to the investigations because, I guess, some of them got scared that these investigations might actually reveal the skeletons that were hiding in their own closets. Yeah, that's not exactly a first for politicians, now is it? Much has happened since then. In 2021, there was a big showdown for the presidency between Keiko Fujimori and far-left candidate Pedro Castillo. And I need to go ahead and clarify something, here's a quick chance to illustrate just how divided Peru is, because when I say leftist, this is pretty much economically leftist. That's like the whole point. I don't want people to think that it's like some kind of major social movement that is going along with that, because that's not the case. Both of these candidates were culturally conservative, and both had publicly opposed same-sex marriage as well as abortion and these sorts of things. But because of the economic policies that Castillo had, these were so different from Fujimori that he was an economic leftist. Just something I need to go ahead and clarify. Anyway, that 2021 election was absolutely wild and a sign of things to come. It included 18 candidates in total, including some convicted felons, money launderers, some xenophobes, a more authoritarian billionaire. There was an economist that was mixed in, a retired soccer player, and even a person that was accused of murdering a journalist. So it was here then that Keiko Fujimori would use every little bit of her power and political machine to try and discredit Castillo and say that he was trying to turn Peru communist. She paid off media outlets to spread fake news about him, used fear-mongering tactics to turn people against him, and even at one point during the vote counting process, she would try to claim electoral fraud against her opponent, and maybe it had an effect, but it didn't quite work. Castillo would win, but the country was still pretty split over the whole affair. The fighting between Fujimori and Castillo supporters would reach a fever pitch, and for a while there were daily protests of the election results taking place all over the country. Look, when I said earlier that Keiko Fujimori mobilized a political machine against Castillo, it may not have been exactly clear just how ugly things got, so I'm gonna need to explain that. Due to her and her allies' influence, Fujimori and the Congress of Peru attempted to impeach Pedro Castillo 3 times in just a little bit over a year. In fact, on the 3rd attempt, he cut them off the morning that they were going to file a motion of censure against him by announcing the dissolution of Congress and imposing an immediate curfew in an ill-advised attempt at self-coup. Yeah, which was not exactly a smart move. What did Congress do? Well, they waited until the 2 main commanders of the army submitted their resignations rather than enforce Castillo's martial law request. Castillo hurriedly attempted to contact Mexican President Manuel López Obrador, asking for political asylum for both him and his family. But unfortunately for Castillo, Peruvian intelligence had tapped his phone sometime shortly before the self-coup attempt, and before he could reach the Mexican embassy, he was intercepted by Peruvian national police officers and charged with inciting rebellion. This then left the door open for Castillo's vice president, Dina Boluarte, to take office. And rarely in history of global politics has there been a president with less power or less of an agenda aside from staying in office. When the people demanded fresh elections to pick up a new president, she denied their requests. This led many Peruvians to start to view her as an illegitimate president, and she became deeply unpopular. How unpopular, you may wonder? Well, in recent months, she attained the infamous title of being the world's most unpopular national leader with an approval rating of just 3%. Just 3. What's even crazier is that for nationwide polls such as this, there's actually a margin of error that hovers, around 1% or less. It's like give or take 1%, which means that her popularity could have actually been 4%, or it could have been a 2% approval rating, which is obviously not good. So how does she even stay in office for the last 2.5 years? She pleased the authoritarian political families that held the real power in Peruvian government. As an example of this, Peruvian law professor Rosa Maria Palacios would persuasively argue that this coalition was led by 4 political families, each led by a distinct boss. You had the Fujimoris, the Cerrons, Cesar Cunha, and Jose Luna Galvez. Without going into too much detail about who these people are, because it's not necessarily needed, the Fujimoris are nominally right-wing, the Cerrons are nominally left-wing, and it's not even really worth trying to place the other 2 clans ideologically because, Palacios aptly describes Luna Galvez as practicing political Airbnb because he tends to rent out spots in his party to the highest bidder. Of course, without any kind of checks of who they are. It just matters that they had money to get in. US, European, and most Latin American governments, with at least a few exceptions, have been largely silent on Peru's democratic erosion, in part because the coalition doesn't really fit neatly into stories about either left-wing or right-wing democratic erosion or one version or the other. It's a whole messy new thing. This is due partly to the fact that Peru's political parties are famously weak and transient. So much like the case of the Philippines, in Peru, the parties form around charismatic personalities and then tend to turn into parties for their families, not necessarily a specific political ideology. Like instead, it's more of a cult of personality situation than parties that exist without the heavy involvement or influence of one family or another. An easy comparison would be like if the United States, instead of Democrats and Republicans, there was a Clinton party, a Bush party, a Kennedy party, a Sanders party, and that sort of thing, where that's what it focuses on. It's specifically the individual and the political family or dynasty. But then in order to stay in power, those guys all get together and make a secret alliance that they're going to do whatever they can for them to all stay in power. And that has been what has been causing so many problems for the people of Peru. For the past 2 years, this coalition has quickly and effectively remade many of Peru's state institutions in pursuit of 3 main objectives. First, to stop Peru's judiciary from investigating political corruption, which it did vigorously until recently. Second, weaken law enforcement and embolden criminal gangs and mafias, illegal gold miners, illicit loggers, and drug traffickers. Third, vest as much power as possible in Congress, the institution that the coalition controls, siphoning it away from the judiciary as well as the executive branch. Boluarte, a weak president trailed by corruption scandals, would go along with the coalition, enabling it. It served her interests. The coalition, in turn, would back her up, until the costs outweighed the benefits, and it started to push her aside. The result? The rapid rise of a peculiar kind of mafia state, one in which a consortium of corrupt politicians and criminal actors rule instead of a single party or strongman figure. Outmigration as a result would surge. In 2022, over 400,000 Peruvians would leave the country without returning, more than any year since 1990. In just the first half of 2023, another 400,000 would leave. While some have flown to Spain, a growing number of Peruvians are heading to the United States southern border, often after first traveling by air or by foot to Mexico. In early March, Mexico's government would announce plans to require visas from Peruvians for the first time since 2012 because of this, citing the fact that Mexican authorities had expelled Peruvians trying to enter the country over 35,000 times between 2021 and 2023 and had detained nearly 144,000 people coming from Peru trying to cross Mexico's borders irregularly during the same years. Mexico's government has yet to impose the new visa policy. Meanwhile, the U.S. Customs and Border Protection, or CBP, would make 75,000 encounters with Peruvians at the U.S.-Mexico border in the fiscal year of 2023, slightly behind the same figure for Haitians. For Peru, the results of all these problems have been devastating. The state has lost legitimacy. Even the technocratic economic policymaking that long drove Peru's robust economic growth, once more insulated from the political churn, is more and more exposed to lawmakers' short-term decision-making. Most concerningly for ordinary Peruvians, organized crime is booming, replacing Amazon rainforest with cocoa farms, invading legal gold mines, extorting small businesses, and carrying out brazen daylight assassinations against those who try to resist. Peruvians have until recently lived in a solid, if imperfect, electoral democracy. They don't want to live in a mafia state. They don't want to live in a lawless country where crime and corruption thrive. And so, people began to protest, organized. Boluarte would respond by having the police and military crack down heavily on any protest or unrest. But this didn't stop the protests. That is because the government of Dina Boluarte would participate in human rights abuses, with her forces allegedly using torture, unauthorized intrusions, police brutality, political repression, extrajudicial killings, and massacres. Which is terrible on its own, but the abuses would also allegedly constitute some racism, disproportionately affecting impoverished indigenous communities. Sadly, massacres of these indigenous communities seem to occur every few years, and while researching the story, there were multiple occasions where 25 or 50 or 75 indigenous Peruvians would be protesting, and then the national police or military would just come right through and wipe them out. Also, while writing the story, we had to skip so much political drama just in the last 9 years alone. I mean, seriously, like pages upon pages of stories detailing political maneuvering that resulted in 7 presidents being in office since just 2018, with 4 of them being placed in office due to their predecessors' impeachment. It's genuinely, honestly, kind of incredible as just how much political drama there has been in the last decade of Peru. More so than in the last 50 years of many other countries. It is perhaps more complicated than a lot of Spanish-language telenovelas, but sacrificing Boluarte at this point seems to be Congress's most recent short-term response to public outrage, which has been building over the years. As for why this happened, it was whipped up by Boluarte's non-response to gunmen going and shooting up a concert in Lima and police repression of Gen Z protesters with tear gas and rubber bullets. The Gen Z protesters were joined by transport workers who say that the government is not doing enough to combat extortion. Taxi and bus drivers say that gangs, including the Venezuelan-based Tren de Aragua, threatened them into paying protection money. These people made so much noise that it finally forced Congress to just ditch Boluarte, making her the latest victim of Peruvian political churn, though obviously the amount of things she did to deserve it is palpable, but still, that's just how it would work. And so, on October 10th, 2025, she was finally impeached by a unanimous vote from Congress. But this didn't do anything to bring the approval rating of Peru's Congress above 10%. People still hated it. Let me explain why. Congress has passed legislation making it harder for the state to police illegal logging and illegal mining, two booming industries that sow environmental destruction and enrich Peru's criminal groups. Lawmakers have also issued carve-outs, allowing companies to avoid paying back taxes, even though Peru already collects close to the region's lowest tax revenue as a share of GDP. And, along with that, they've made it harder for prosecutors to strike plea deals, the very key tool that is needed for investigating organized crime, even as Venezuela's bloody Tren de Aragua gang has gained a foothold in Lima and Peru's ports beckon to enterprising narco-traffickers. It's not good. And over the past 2 years, these corrupt leaders in Congress have often joined forces to tie the hands of prosecutors investigating crime and corruption, to purge and pack judicial bodies, and to rewrite a third of the Constitution. The last step barely made the news abroad, but it is the most dangerous easily. Lawmakers created a new upper chamber with no term limits to sidestep a ban on congressional re-election. This would be the new super Senate, basically, as it has been called, with sweeping power over the lower house, judiciary, and president. It is the perfect tool to extend the PAC's hold on power past 2026. As a result, this coalition of Peruvian politicians have officially made itself the most powerful legislative branch on Earth. With upcoming national elections in April of 2026, it's then going to be interesting to see if the people of Peru, specifically its Gen Z population, will even allow the government to stay in power until then. Having seen the example set by the citizens of Nepal, Madagascar, Indonesia, and other countries, the people of Peru might just decide that they've truly had enough and push for a complete government overhaul. This would have to involve either the neutrality or support of the Peruvian National Police or the Peruvian military, which the people currently don't have. But if the story of Nepal is any indication of a possible likely future, all it would take is one incident of non-indigenous Peruvians being slaughtered by the government for the next Gen Z revolution to pop off in the streets of Lima. The protests haven't stopped yet, but the main problem is that they are still disorganized and fractured into many groups. There's no single leader of any movement representing the will of the people. But then again, there was no single leader in Nepal for their most recent revolution. And beyond that, Peruvians do have common demands. They do seek an end to corruption, better safety and security, and increased work and job opportunities. If they can manage to get organized, then they stand a decent chance to place enough pressure on the government to keep the upcoming elections fair, and maybe for some normalcy to return to Peru. And now, do we think that that's the most likely thing to happen? Not really, and that's partially due to who took Dina Boluarte's place as president after she was impeached. José Jerí, a political novice elected with only around 11,000 votes in 2021, currently serves as president of Congress, and he became the country's latest head of state. And if you think inexperience and low name recognition might be this guy's only issue, I got some bad news for you. José Jerí happens to have, in his relatively short political career, already racked up a significant amount of scandals. For one, he was caught partying and not recognizing social distancing during the country's COVID lockdowns back in early 2022, which is not necessarily all that bad, but it is one of those cases of political hypocrisy that really riles people up, of course. Then there was the fact that he lied on his taxes and hid income and assets obtained from illegal enrichment practices, so that's another thing. And back in 2023, he apparently took a bribe of over 150,000 Peruvian soles from a Peruvian businesswoman to ensure the approval of public works projects. And most unsettlingly, in January of 2025, he was accused of forcing himself on an unconscious woman at a New Year's Eve party. That is absolutely terrible, but even that one case gets worse, because the court would order Jerí to undergo psychological treatment for impulsive and pathological sexual behaviors, which he refused to go to for 5 months, and after a separate complaint was brought up against him in court for disobeying their authority. So it's not like José Jerí is exactly filling the people of Peru with anything approaching hope. Sadly, he seems like he's more of the same. Let us just go ahead and say right now here on this channel that we think it is incredibly likely that if the Peruvian government and President Jerí don't meet the demands of people soon, then there is likely going to be another government that gets toppled by a Gen Z uprising. The main reason that this is our prediction is because the Peruvian political system is essentially a flashpoint situation that at any given moment is ready to explode, particularly with the number of scandals that keep on coming out of it. The people are getting more organized and starting to use hashtags like hashtag Gen Z, hashtag corruption, hashtag protest Peru. All of these things are currently trending and bringing together a movement. It's only a matter of time. Protest organizers have already stated that they will not stop protesting and marching until major systemic changes have occurred. If there isn't a major civil unrest event that takes place and an overthrow of the current status quo before April 2026 elections, there almost certainly will be mass protests and violence after the elections, because that likely will not change anything. This is, of course, due to the corrupt families in power in the Peruvian Congress doing whatever it takes to stay in power, whether it means altering election law or the results or enacting martial law, anything. All it takes is one major misstep from the Peruvian government for it to feel the wrath of its people. And then everything will light itself on fire once more. But of course, my friends, we can't really talk about that until it actually happens. That is where we are today. Thank you all very much for watching. I really do appreciate it. This has been a really wild time, and I have a lot of work ahead of me as it is that I'm preparing to leave for Japan. In fact, by the time this video comes out, it's probably the day before I leave, or just 2 days before it is that I leave for Japan. So please note that there's going to be a lot of stuff that I'm going to be talking about. And even when I'm in Japan, I do plan on doing a whole thing about the Japanese birth crisis and what is happening over there, because the future is looking quite messy. Either way, thank you all very much for watching. I appreciate it. I will see you all next time. Best of luck. Goodbye, my friends.